Dozens of people passed by her that day. Neighbors, drivers, even people who knew her well enough to recognize her face without thinking twice about her name. They all saw Margaret Whittaker sitting there on her front steps, still and quiet as the snow settled gently around her. And they kept going, each one carrying on with their day, each one assuming that what they were seeing was ordinary. No one stopped. No one asked a question. No one stayed long enough to notice what didn't quite fit, except a 9-year-old girl named Sarah. And what she noticed in that moment, something so small it almost didn't register, is the only reason Margaret Whittaker is still alive today. Except even Sarah almost didn't notice, because for a brief second she did what everyone else had done. She looked, she hesitated, and she nearly convinced herself that everything was fine. And what she did next gave someone a second chance at life, a moment that would later be understood, not as dramatic or extraordinary, but as a quiet decision made in a space where most people would have chosen differently. Margaret Whittaker had lived on that street for years, long enough for her presence to become part of the background of everyday life, something familiar but rarely examined closely. She was the kind of neighbor people acknowledged with a wave, someone who kept a routine, who moved through her days with a sense of quiet consistency that made everything about her seem stable. On most afternoons, she would step outside briefly, sometimes to check the mail, sometimes just to take in the air before returning indoors. Nothing about that routine suggested risk. Nothing about it hinted at the possibility that something could go wrong in a way that would be easy to miss. That day, the snow began falling earlier than expected, soft at first, then steadily enough to change the way the entire street looked within minutes. It covered the sidewalks, softened the edges of driveways, and created a calm that made everything feel slower, almost peaceful. Margaret stepped outside as she had done many times before, but what followed was not part of any routine she had known. At some point, something shifted in her body in a way she did not immediately understand. It was not sudden, not dramatic, not the kind of moment that forces immediate action. Instead, it was gradual, a subtle loss of balance, a quiet weakening that made standing feel more difficult than it should have been. She sat down on the steps, likely intending to rest for just a moment, to gather herself before going back inside. But that moment stretched, and as it did, the cold began to take hold in a way that was easy to underestimate. The human body can adapt to discomfort, can normalize sensations that should signal danger, and in Margaret's case, that adaptation worked against her. Minutes passed, then more, and with each passing moment, her ability to respond, to call for help, to recognize the severity of her situation, began to fade. From the outside, it looked like stillness. From within, it was something far more dangerous. People passed by, one after another, each one seeing the same image, but interpreting it in a way that allowed them to move on. A woman sitting on her front steps in the cold might seem unusual, but not necessarily alarming, especially in a neighborhood where familiarity reduces suspicion. Someone might have thought she was resting. Someone else might have assumed she had stepped out briefly and would go back inside shortly. These assumptions, small and seemingly harmless, created a pattern where no one felt the need to intervene. And when enough people make the same assumption, it begins to feel like confirmation rather than oversight. The longer Margaret remained there, the more normal it appeared to those who passed, because nothing disrupted that perception. Nothing signaled urgency in a way that demanded attention. It is in moments like these that situations become dangerous, not because they are hidden, but because they are seen and misunderstood. Sarah stepped off the school bus 2 houses down, her boots landing softly in the snow, her mind still partially occupied with the ordinary thoughts of a school day. The routine was familiar. The path home, something she could walk without thinking. The houses around her forming a pattern she had known for years. As she began walking, her attention shifted in small ways, noticing the cold, the quiet, The way the snow had already begun to change the look of the street. When she glanced toward Margaret's house, what she saw did not immediately stand out as an emergency. It was just a woman sitting on the steps, motionless, facing forward. For a second, maybe longer, Sarah processed it the same way everyone else had. And then something changed. Not in what she saw, but in how it felt. There are moments when the mind recognizes something before it can explain it. When a detail does not align with expectation in a way that is difficult to put into words. Sarah slowed her steps, her attention drawn back to Margaret in a way she could not ignore. The stillness was different now, not just calm, but fixed, unresponsive in a way that did not feel right. She looked around, perhaps expecting someone else to step in, someone older, someone who would take control of the situation and confirm whether there was anything to worry about. But the street remained quiet, unchanged, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. That absence of reaction from others could have been enough to convince her to keep walking, to trust that everything was fine because no one else was concerned. And for a brief moment, she almost did. She took a step forward, then another, creating distance between herself and the image that had caught her attention. It would have been easy to continue, to reach her front door, to leave the moment behind as something unimportant. But that feeling, the one she could not fully explain, stayed with her. It did not fade as she moved away. It did not resolve into certainty that everything was okay. Instead, it grew stronger, more insistent, until ignoring it became more difficult than acting on it. She turned back, her decision made not through logic or analysis, but through a simple unwillingness to dismiss what she had felt. When she approached Margaret and spoke, the response she received confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Something was wrong, and it was more serious than it appeared. Sarah did not stay long after that. She did not try to solve the problem herself or attempt to understand every detail. Instead, she did something far more important. She ran home. Her urgency carried through her voice as she spoke to her parents. Her words direct and filled with a certainty that made hesitation feel inappropriate. She described what she had seen, how Margaret had not responded properly, how something felt off in a way she could not ignore. Her parents reacted quickly, recognizing that tone, understanding that this was not a situation to delay. They followed her back without wasting time, their pace matching the urgency she had brought into the house. And as they approached Margaret, what had been uncertain from a distance became undeniable up close. Margaret's condition had worsened in the time since Sarah first saw her. Her body had grown colder, her responsiveness weaker, her ability to communicate nearly gone. What might have looked like rest from across the street was clearly something else entirely now. They moved her inside as carefully as they could, aware that time mattered even if they did not fully understand how much. The call to emergency services was made quickly, and from that moment on, the situation moved into the hands of people trained to recognize and respond to exactly this kind of danger. When the paramedics arrived, their assessment was immediate, their actions efficient, their focus entirely on stabilizing a condition that had progressed further than anyone outside that moment had realized. Margaret was experiencing advanced hypothermia, a condition that can develop quietly and become life-threatening without obvious warning. As body temperature drops, the ability to think clearly diminishes. Movement slows, and the signals that might normally indicate distress become less visible. In many cases, individuals do not recognize the severity of their situation until they are no longer capable of responding effectively. That is what had happened here. By the time Sarah noticed something was wrong, Margaret had already reached a point where intervention was not just helpful, but necessary. The paramedics worked to stabilize her before transporting her to the hospital, where the focus would shift to gradually restoring her body temperature and monitoring for complications that can arise when the body has been exposed to cold for too long. At the hospital, the seriousness of the situation became even clearer. The medical team worked carefully, aware that recovery from hypothermia requires precision and patience. Raising body temperature too quickly can create additional risks, and every step needed to be controlled. Margaret's condition was described in terms that emphasized how close she had come to a much worse outcome. There was no exaggeration, no attempt to dramatize what had happened, only a clear explanation that the timing of intervention had made a critical difference. A delay of even a few more minutes could have resulted in a situation that would have been far more difficult to reverse. That reality settled in gradually, not as a shocking revelation, but as a quiet understanding of how narrow the margin had been.
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What makes this story resonate is not just the outcome, but the sequence of decisions that led to it. Each person who passed by made a choice, even if it did not feel like one at the time. They saw something, interpreted it, and moved on. Those choices were not made with intention to ignore danger, but they had that effect nonetheless. Sarah's choice, in contrast, was to pause, to question, and to act on a feeling that could have been dismissed just as easily. That difference, small as it may seem, is what changed everything. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to reflect on what had happened. Conversations emerged, not centered on blame, but on awareness. People revisited their memory of that afternoon, trying to recall what they had seen, how long Margaret had been there, whether there had been something they could have recognized if they had looked a little closer. These reflections did not produce clear answers, but they did create a shift in perspective. Situations that once seemed ordinary were now viewed with a bit more attention, a bit more willingness to question whether everything was as it appeared. Margaret eventually returned home, her recovery steady, her presence once again part of the street she had lived on for years. When asked about the moment that changed everything, Sarah's response remained simple. She did not describe it as bravery, did not frame it as a decision made under pressure. She said she thought it was a good idea. That simplicity carries weight because it highlights how accessible that kind of decision can be. It does not require special training or extraordinary awareness, only a willingness to trust a moment of uncertainty and respond to it. The difference between noticing and ignoring is often measured in seconds, in small choices that feel insignificant at the time, but carry consequences that extend far beyond them. And so, the story leaves behind a question, not as a challenge, but as something worth considering. If you had been there, walking down that same street, seeing the same image that so many others saw, would you have stopped? Or would you have kept going, trusting that everything was fine because it appeared that way? A few minutes after Sarah ran inside, the house no longer felt like an ordinary afternoon home. The calm that had existed before her words arrived had been replaced by urgency that nobody had planned for, yet everyone immediately understood. Her parents moved without hesitation, grabbing coats, keys, anything that signaled speed rather than preparation. Sarah followed closely behind, her breathing uneven, her mind replaying what she had seen on the steps outside Margaret Whittaker's house. The walk back felt shorter, not because distance had changed, but because awareness had replaced distraction. Every few steps, Sarah looked ahead as if expecting the scene to confirm itself differently, as if the memory might correct itself and turn into something harmless. But when they reached the house, nothing had changed, except now there were more eyes on it, more understanding of what silence had been hiding. Inside, the situation shifted immediately from uncertainty to action. Margaret Whittaker was still there, still present, but no longer just a still figure on the steps. The moment Sarah's parents approached her, the difference between observation and reality became clear. This was no longer something that could be dismissed or delayed. The cold had already done more than most people passing by would have ever imagined from a distance. Margaret's responses were limited, her condition fragile in a way that made every second matter, in a way that was difficult to explain without being there. Sarah stayed just behind her parents, not speaking, simply watching as the situation she had interrupted now unfolded into something larger than her initial understanding. It is often in moments like this that the world feels slightly unreal, as if ordinary life has paused and something else has temporarily taken its place. That is what it felt like for Sarah as she stood near the doorway, watching her parents carefully guide Margaret inside. The house that had once been just another part of the street was now the center of urgency. Warm air replaced cold wind, but that contrast only highlighted how long Margaret had been exposed outside without proper response. When she was finally seated inside, there was a brief moment where everyone seemed to hold their breath, not out of panic, but out of uncertainty about what came next. The call to emergency services was made quickly, and from that point forward, time began to feel structured in a different way. It was no longer about minutes passing normally, but about intervals of action and waiting. Sarah's parents spoke in short phrases, focused on coordination rather than explanation. Sarah remained quiet, her attention fixed on Margaret, who now showed clearer signs that something serious had been happening long before anyone arrived. There is a particular kind of realization that comes when a situation moves from suspicion to confirmation. It is not loud or dramatic. It settles in quietly. The understanding that what looked simple from a distance was actually far more serious up close. When the paramedics arrived, their presence changed the atmosphere again. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, and calm in a way that only experience allows. They assessed Margaret without unnecessary delay, recognizing patterns that most people would not notice without training. What they saw confirmed what the situation had already begun to suggest. Margaret Whitaker had been affected by prolonged exposure to cold in a way that required immediate and careful attention. Hypothermia does not always announce itself clearly at the beginning. It often develops quietly, reducing awareness, slowing responses, and making it difficult for the person affected to recognize how serious the situation has become. That gradual progression is part of what makes it so dangerous when it goes unnoticed. As they worked, Sarah stood slightly to the side, not interfering, simply observing the transformation of a moment she had first encountered alone on a sidewalk. Now, that same moment had expanded into a coordinated response involving multiple people, equipment, and urgent communication. It was difficult for her to connect the still image she had seen earlier with the active scene unfolding in front of her. The difference between those two versions of reality was not distance, but awareness. What had been invisible to others had been present all along, waiting for someone to recognize it. The transport to the hospital was carried out with care, and once the ambulance doors closed, the immediate intensity of the scene shifted into a quieter kind of tension. There is a specific silence that follows moments of urgency, where everything has already been set in motion, and there is nothing left to do but wait for outcomes. Sarah's parents remained close, speaking softly, while Sarah herself seemed to process the experience in layers rather than all at once. She had seen Margaret before, during, and after the moment everything changed, but the full meaning of it had not yet settled into place. At the hospital, Margaret Whitaker was taken into a space designed for stabilization, where the focus was not on narrative or explanation, but on physical recovery. The medical team worked with precision, carefully addressing the effects of prolonged exposure and monitoring her response as her body began the slow process of returning to normal temperature regulation. In situations like this, the most important factor is often time. Not just how much of it is passed, but how much remains before the body reaches a point where recovery becomes significantly more complicated. What made Margaret's case notable was not just the condition itself, but the timing of intervention. She had been found within a window where recovery was still possible, without irreversible consequences, though that window had been narrower than anyone on the street could have known. Hours later, when the immediate danger had passed, the explanation given to Sarah's parents carried a weight that was not dramatic, but factual. Margaret's condition had been serious, and had it continued unnoticed for longer, the outcome could have shifted in a direction that would have been far more difficult to reverse. There was no emphasis on exaggeration or emotional framing, only clarity about how close the situation had come to becoming something permanent. That realization did not land all at once. It settled gradually as the understanding of what had happened began to take shape beyond the immediate experience. Meanwhile, Sarah remained with her parents, still processing her role in the sequence of events. What stood out most to her was not the medical explanation or the urgency of the response, but the simplicity of her own decision. She had not planned anything, had not calculated outcomes, had not considered consequences in advance. She had seen something that did not feel right and chosen not to ignore it. That choice, which felt small in the moment, had become the dividing point between two very different possibilities. Later, when Margaret Whittaker regained enough strength to understand what had happened, she was told how she had been found and by whom. There is a particular kind of silence that follows such explanations, where gratitude is present, but words feel insufficient to fully contain it. Margaret remembered stepping outside that afternoon, remembered sitting on the steps, but the space between that memory and the hospital room was unclear to her.
That gap is part of what makes situations like this so difficult to reconstruct afterward. From the inside, it does not feel like a sequence of events. It feels like a missing section of time that others must help explain. In the days that followed, the story circulated quietly through the neighborhood. It was not treated as spectacle, but as reflection. People began to reconsider their memory of that afternoon, trying to understand how something so serious had gone unnoticed by so many. There was no single answer, only patterns of assumption that had aligned in a way that prevented action. Each person had seen something that did not immediately demand attention, and each had made a decision based on that interpretation. None of those decisions felt wrong at the time, yet together they formed a gap that had only been closed by someone who chose to look again. She was told how she had been found and by whom. There is a particular kind of silence that follows such explanations, where gratitude is present, but words feel insufficient to fully contain it. Margaret remembered stepping outside that afternoon, remembered sitting on the steps, but the space between that memory and the hospital room was unclear to her. That gap is part of what makes situations like this so difficult to reconstruct afterward. From the inside, it does not feel like a sequence of events. It feels like a missing section of time that others must help explain. In the days that followed, the story circulated quietly through the neighborhood. It was not treated as spectacle, but as reflection. People began to reconsider their memory of that afternoon, trying to understand how something so serious had gone unnoticed by so many. There was no single answer, only patterns of assumption that had aligned in a way that prevented action. Each person had seen something that did not immediately demand attention, and each had made a decision based on that interpretation. None of those decisions felt wrong at the time, yet together they formed a gap that had only been closed by someone who chose to look again. She was told how she had been found and by whom. There is a particular kind of silence that follows such explanations, where gratitude is present, but words feel insufficient to fully contain it. Margaret remembered stepping outside that afternoon, remembered sitting on the steps, but the space between that memory and the hospital room was unclear to her. That gap is part of what makes situations like this so difficult to reconstruct afterward. From the inside, it does not feel like a sequence of events. It feels like a missing section of time that others must help explain. In the days that followed, the story circulated quietly through the neighborhood. It was not treated as spectacle, but as reflection. People began to reconsider their memory of that afternoon, trying to understand how something so serious had gone unnoticed by so many. There was no single answer, only patterns of assumption that had aligned in a way that prevented action. Each person had seen something that did not immediately demand attention, and each had made a decision based on that interpretation. None of those decisions felt wrong at the time, yet together they formed a gap that had only been closed by someone who chose to look again. So serious had gone unnoticed by so many. There was no single answer, only patterns of assumption that had aligned in a way that prevented action. Each person had seen something that did not immediately demand attention, and each had made a decision based on that interpretation. None of those decisions felt wrong at the time, yet together they formed a gap that had only been closed by someone who chose to look again. She was told how she had been found, and by whom. There is a particular kind of silence that follows such explanations, where gratitude is present, but words feel insufficient to fully contain it. Margaret remembered stepping outside that afternoon, remembered sitting on the steps, but the space between that memory and the hospital room was unclear to her. That gap is part of what makes situations like this so difficult to reconstruct afterward. From the inside, it does not feel like a sequence of events. It feels like a missing section of time that others must help explain. In the days that followed, the story circulated quietly through the neighborhood. It was not treated as spectacle, but as reflection. People began to reconsider their memory of that afternoon, trying to understand how something so serious had gone unnoticed by so many. There was no single answer, only patterns of assumption that had aligned in a way that prevented action. Each person had seen something that did not immediately demand attention, and each had made a decision based on that interpretation. None of those decisions felt wrong at the time, yet together they formed a gap that had only been closed by someone who chose to look again.
Sarah did not describe her actions in elevated terms when asked later. She did not present herself as someone who had done something extraordinary. She simply said she thought it was a good idea to check. That simplicity is what gives the story its weight. It removes the distance between ordinary judgment and meaningful action. It shows that in many situations, the difference is not knowledge or expertise, but willingness to question what appears stable on the surface. As time passed, Margaret recovered and returned to her home, and life on the street resumed its usual rhythm. Snow melted, routines returned, and the moment began to settle into memory rather than immediate presence. But for those who had been part of it, something remained slightly altered. Not fear, not caution in an exaggerated sense, but awareness. A recognition that what appears normal from a distance can sometimes contain details that only become visible when someone chooses to pay closer attention. And in the quiet reflection that followed, one question remained, not as a conclusion, but as something each person carried differently. If you had been walking down that same street, seeing the same still figure on the steps, would you have noticed what Sarah noticed? Or would you have continued forward, trusting that silence always means safety? And still, even after everything that happened, the most difficult part of the story is not the medical emergency, not the cold, and not even the minutes that nearly changed everything. It is the realization that nothing about that afternoon looked like something people were trained to react to. There was no obvious alarm, no loud signal, no dramatic collapse that forced immediate attention. It was quiet, too quiet. And that is exactly why it was missed so many times before Sarah ever reached that sidewalk. What makes situations like this difficult to accept is how normal everything appears in real time. A person sitting on their front steps does not automatically register as danger. The mind is designed to interpret patterns quickly, to categorize what it sees and move on unless something clearly breaks expectation. That afternoon, nothing broke expectation in a loud enough way for most people to stop. The snow softened everything, including perception. It made edges unclear, details easier to overlook, and urgency harder to identify. And so the world continued moving past Margaret Whittaker as if she was part of the scenery, not a person quietly slipping into a condition she could not control. Sarah, however, experienced that same moment differently, not because she had more information, but because she allowed herself a second look. That second look is often where the difference begins. It is rarely the first glance that matters in situations like this, but the hesitation afterward. The brief pause where uncertainty is allowed to exist instead of being dismissed. When Sarah stopped, It was not because she understood exactly what was wrong. It was because she did not fully trust the assumption that nothing was wrong. That gap between certainty and doubt is where action sometimes begins. In the days after Margaret Whittaker returned home from the hospital, that moment on the steps began to take on a different meaning for everyone involved. At first, it was simply relief that she had survived. Then, slowly, it became something more reflective. People began to reconstruct their own memory of that afternoon, trying to understand what they had seen and how it had registered in their minds at the time. Many realized they had noticed her, but in the same breath had already assigned meaning to what they saw. She is sitting, so she must be resting. She is outside, so she must be fine. She is familiar, so nothing unusual is happening. Each assumption on its own felt reasonable, but together they created a blind spot large enough for a serious situation to pass through unnoticed. Margaret herself did not remember the full progression of what had happened outside her home. That part of the experience remained fragmented, as if time had lost continuity between stepping outside and waking up in a medical setting where everything had already been addressed. When she was told that a child had been the one to notice something was wrong, there was a long pause that followed, not out of disbelief, but out of the difficulty of processing how close things had come to ending differently without anyone realizing it. That realization does not arrive as shock alone. It arrives as a quiet recognition that ordinary moments can shift in direction without announcing themselves. Sarah, on the other hand, did not describe her actions as anything unusual. When asked, she simply repeated that something did not feel right, and she thought it should be checked. There was no sense of heroism in her explanation, no attempt to elevate the moment into something larger than what it felt like to her at the time. That simplicity is what gives the story its weight, because it removes the distance between what people imagine as extraordinary action and what actually happened in reality, which was a child noticing something, choosing not to ignore it, and asking for help. What remains most striking about the entire sequence of events is how small the decision point truly was. There was no long debate, no structured reasoning process, no formal understanding of medical risk. There was only a moment of observation, followed by a choice not to dismiss it. And yet, that choice intersected with a situation that had already progressed far beyond what anyone casually passing by could have understood. That intersection is what changed the outcome. Not knowledge alone, not training, but attention applied at the right moment. In the broader reflection that followed, the neighborhood began to see that afternoon differently. It was no longer just a single incident involving one person in distress and another person who happened to notice. It became a reminder of how easily everyday environments can hide situations that require awareness beyond surface interpretation. People do not move through their lives expecting to encounter emergencies that appear ordinary at first glance. And because of that, most rely on patterns of normalcy to guide their responses. But patterns are not always reliable indicators of safety. They are simply familiar. Sarah's experience did not change her life in a dramatic way afterward. She returned to school, returned to routine, returned to the same walk home. But something subtle shifted in how she described what she saw around her. She became more willing to pause, to look again when something felt unclear, to accept that not everything important presents itself in an obvious form. That kind of awareness is not loud or visible. It does not announce itself. It exists quietly in the background of how someone moves through the world. And for Margaret Whittaker, recovery meant returning to a life that now carried a memory of how easily it could have taken a different direction. Not in a fearful way, but in a reflective one. There is a difference between living as if danger is everywhere and living with awareness that small moments matter more than they appear to at first glance. Her experience became part of that understanding, not as something to dwell on, but as something that subtly reshaped perspective. When the story is finally reduced to its simplest form, it is not about snow or timing or even the medical response. It is about attention, about what is seen, what is assumed, and what is acted upon. Most people do not miss things because they are careless. They miss them because everything appears consistent enough not to question. And in that space between consistency and certainty, important moments can pass unnoticed. The question left behind is not meant to create fear or doubt, but reflection. Because somewhere in everyday life, similar moments continue to exist, not identical in detail, but familiar in structure. Someone sitting quietly, something not fully explained, a feeling that does not immediately align with what is expected. And in those moments, the difference between walking past and stopping is often smaller than people realize. And so the story does not end with resolution alone. It ends with awareness of how easily the ordinary can contain something that matters, and how often the decision to notice it rests not in certainty, but in the willingness to pause long enough to see it clearly. Dozens of people, neighbors, driver, even people who knew her well enough to recognize her face without thinking twice about her name, they all saw Margaret Whittaker front steps. Still,